Thank you so much, Susan. A room full of people, it's great, but I know nobody's here to listen to me. And I know everybody got questions lined up for him. So thank you, Nathaniel, for being here. This is really the hot seat, as you know, right? It's supposed to be a fireside chat, and it's going to be a hot seat, but we're gonna get started with a few things. So there was a network, a small college network way back, yeah? And then it grew into a school network, and then it became a platform for people to connect, or families, friends, and then it became this huge platform where we all connect. And from a basic platform to a huge global giant. And this also means that we're having essentially large conversations around how technology's ability to shape our conversations and shaping modern society and our interactions and what we do on the platform that we've chosen to be on. So before I get into the questions, I just want to introduce him, but this is really interesting for me. Nathaniel, thank you again for being here. And he's the head of security policy at Meta, where he leads the company-wide effort to counter emerging and persistent threats across the company's platforms, including influence operations, cyber espionage, and cybersecurity risks. He's an engineer and a lawyer and has worked in security for more than 15 years. He has taught computer science, built and secured computer networks, and prosecuted cybercrimes at the US State Department for Justice. He served as cybersecurity policy person at the National Security Council of the White House and as head of the cybersecurity strategy at Illumio. At the NSC, he developed the US government policy on key technology and cybersecurity challenges, including encryption, cyber deterrence, internet governance, and network security. So thank you for joining the chat. I've already had lots of questions. People have already given me a lot of questions to post you, but they can do it themselves. So get started. One of the questions that I would really like to know about is Meta has these adversarial threat reports, and a lot of people were asking, what does it mean? What is an adversarial threat report? And when you have a situation where coordinated inauthentic behavior happens, what do you do? How do you do it? And how do you monitor it? What can Meta do to make the platform a safer place?
Thank you. And first, let me just say thank you, everyone, for coming, for the conversations over the last couple of days, and for all the work that you do. I deeply appreciate everything you're doing, and I'm glad that we can do a little bit to help bring together this community for the discussion. And Doroxi, thank you again. Congratulations on the award last night.
Thank you.
And for everything that you've done. So I lead security policy at Meta, which, as Doroxi mentioned, means that I coordinate our work across the company to track and counter determined adversaries. You were describing a little bit sort of the evolution of Facebook.
Yes.
Right? I think here at the conference, we've heard already powerful speeches, engagement from Maria, from others,
yes,
on the nature of the world we face today, the march and the rise of illiberal voices, the rise of autocracies around the world. Many of these trends predate the internet. They predate social media. But one of the things the internet does and social media does is it connects people. And by connecting people, it accelerates all of these trends. It accelerates positive trends, right? There are a lot of really good things that have come out of public debate that has changed from the connectivity of the internet and social media, whether that is far more diverse public discussions today than ever before, movements like the Black Lives Matter movement, the Me Too movement. But whenever you have a communications medium like this, threat actors exploit it. They abuse it and they use it to try to cause harm. And we've seen that time and time again. And I think the core mission or responsibility that I feel, and that I think probably everyone here feels to some degree, is how do we preserve some of the positive, diversifying elements of public debate since the internet has developed, while countering the sorts of threats that we're seeing. My team has a very specific piece of this puzzle. I joined Meta in early 2018. as we were learning what had happened in the 2016 elections. And the goal of my team and the mission of my team is that for a lot of content moderation, you're drawing boundaries and drawing lines, what should be permitted, what shouldn't be permitted. But for a certain subset of problems, there is an adversary on the other side who isn't just making a mistake. They are repeatedly, intentionally, and systematically trying to abuse your systems, trying to cause harm across the internet, trying to mislead or target our users. And what that means is any step that you take as a defender, it's not just that they're going to try to avoid it, they're going to try to use it against you, right? Really simple example, we have seen a rise in recent years of efforts to compromise people's accounts. A number of people in this room have experienced this. Unfortunately, journalists are a common target for this type of thing. People's accounts get taken down for some reason. You want to give them a system so that they can go in and get access to the account back. One of the first things you see threat actors do is they abuse that system you created to try to actually compromise the accounts of people you're trying to defend. And so whenever you're dealing with determined adversaries, you have to think about this as a two-player game. There's a threat actor on the other side, and they are going to continually try to cause harm even as you are trying to stop them. You were asking specifically about our adversarial threat reports.
Yes.
So
yes.
One of the key things that my team does, and that many of you may have seen, is we track and counter threat actors. We began with a focus on what we call CIB, coordinated inauthentic behavior, sort of a mouthful, but what it means is coordinated networks of fake accounts that are trying to mislead people about who's behind them and use that deception to manipulate or corrupt public debate. When we find these CIB campaigns, we take them down, and then we publish information about them. We put out public threat reports where we describe who is behind it, if we can prove it, the tactics they were using, the types of content they were sharing, the people they were targeting. And in addition, we share data about that operation. So for every operation that we publish, we share data of all of the sort of public components of that campaign with researchers.
How
so
regularly?
They can study it themselves.
How regularly do you publish reports? Quarterly?
Currently, we publish reports quarterly. Historically, we began this work in late 2017. And as we were learning to do it, we sort of at first did it whenever we found one. Then we established a program and did it monthly. Now we do it quarterly, and it's expanded. So it's not just CIB. It is other types of threats as well, including hacking and cyber espionage, including what we call brigading or harassment, coordinated efforts to silence people and to silence voices. Often journalists are targets for this. Women are unfortunately disproportionate targets for this. And so the point of the adversarial threat reports is to do two things, well, three things. First, share information about these threats so that people understand what's out there. Second, share information with other defender teams to empower them. The biggest difference between countering these threats today and countering them in 2016 is that there are now determined teams of experts in government, in industry, in civil society, and in the media working to counter these threats and sharing information to counter them. And part of the goal here is to give people as much data as possible so they can tackle them. And the third thing is to deter the bad guys, to impose cost on them, not just by exposing them, but by demonstrating their techniques so the techniques get less effective. That's the goal. And that's why we share them repeatedly. And that's why we've been expanding what we share and how much we share. So just in December, we actually announced we now have an archive built on top of CrowdTangle that researchers can go into to see all the past operations that we've removed so they can study them and they can understand what's happened. If anyone is interested, is from a research organization and is interested in that, let me know. There is an onboarding process to get you access to it. And it's been very useful and we're looking to expand that.
Okay. So
sorry, that was a long-winded answer.
That was a long
I
answer.
do that sometimes.
So it's a room full of journalists. So we want to know from what you have studied, what are the specific threats that you see against journalists? We do understand, Maria is here, we all understand most people have been bullied, harassed, and their accounts have been taken over, all of that. What are the specific threats that you have seen as probably as emerging threats?
So if we talk about the types of trends we're seeing and the types of threats we're seeing, right? I mentioned earlier, my team is not as involved in questions like particular pieces of content. We're much more focused on the behaviors that these threat actors engage in. So one of the things we track is how these trends are evolving. 3 types of threats that I see journalists face, 3 categories that I'll talk about. First is efforts to compromise their accounts, and we can talk about some techniques there. Second is the type of brigading and harassment that we've seen journalists around the world face. Maria has faced it and others, right? And the third is determined efforts to target journalists directly as the vehicles for influence operations. So this is actually a pretty interesting one, but let me talk about each of them. If we talk about account compromise, right? We increasingly see efforts by threat actors to target journalists and compromise their accounts. And to do that, maybe to steal information that you all have, to use it as a way to identify targets so they could try to silence journalists. Another example that we have seen, though, is a particularly interesting one. In the lead up to and since the invasion of Ukraine, we have been tracking and countering a threat actor known as ghostwriter. There's been a bunch of public reporting on this. We've published a good bit and others have as well. This is a threat actor that operates across Central and Eastern Europe and that has a history of targeting the accounts of prominent voices. Since the Ukraine conflict, we have seen them shift to particularly focus on Ukrainian military officials. And what they do is they compromise their accounts and they then attempt to use those compromised accounts to post false narratives. For example, they will try to take a Ukrainian military official and use that account to post a YouTube video suggesting that the Ukrainian military is fleeing or surrendering. This is a really interesting example of why someone might try to compromise accounts and why we might see journalists targeted. Journalists are, and you all have, an incredibly powerful reservoir of legitimacy and authority. And so we see threat actors try to piggyback on that. They try to compromise these accounts and then use them to push false narratives. Our team has been tracking this particular threat for some time. We have had good luck so far in stopping them from actually posting. We catch them as they compromise and block them from causing the harm. But we know they're still trying and they're targeting multiple platforms. And so something that journalists should think about in terms of protecting themselves in this space. The simplest thing, and we will talk more about this, I will put in a plug, the ICFJ is running a couple of journalist safety programs after this. There are 2 back-to-back. They have the same material, so you can attend either one. Recommendations on how to protect yourself online. I would strongly urge everyone to attend them. I think it's extremely important work. One thing to think about is enabling 2-factor authentication on all of your accounts. And I know everyone hears this all the time, but it's remarkable what a small percentage of people do it. If we take that ghostwriter actor, there's a reason this story is particularly interesting. I said that they were targeting Facebook, but the truth is they're targeting a whole range of social media platforms, and they don't start with social media. These threat actors often don't. They begin by compromising your personal email, and then they use that to get into whatever they can. And so as you think about different accounts to protect, I think people often think about their banking, they think about their public presences, but we sometimes forget our personal email, which ends up being sort of the key to the kingdom. So I think that's one very simple thing that everyone should think about. A second thing that I will mention is we have a program called Facebook Protect. Facebook Protect is a program designed to give additional defenses to highly targeted voices. This includes activists, politicians, and journalists. There are currently about 9 million people enrolled around the world. I would imagine a number of you in the room are enrolled, but if you're not and you're interested, there is a public page where you can apply to be a member. And also, if you come to the ICFJ training next, you can speak to the team and we can make sure that you get added. Facebook Protect does 3 things. 1, it requires you to turn on 2-factor authentication and takes a number of steps to make that easier. Second, it provides additional monitoring and protections around a whole range of threats. So it adds additional defenses. And third, it flags your account internally so that if there's targeting of it, our defender teams know and can make sure to take steps as quickly as possible to counter the threat. So account hacking is one type of targeting.
Yeah, 30 seconds, yeah?
But I don't want to lose the others. The second is coordinated harassment. And we see this more and more. Illiberal voices and critics organizing online to try to silence activist voices and silence those who are speaking truth. And journalists, if we've heard here on this, at this conference, this is your job. There are a couple of things to do about this that I want to highlight. The first is there are a series of steps that people can take to protect themselves, which we outline in our Journalist Safety Hub. And I would encourage people to take a look at that. The second is we have programs like Facebook Protect, which do provide additional protections. But the third is a new program that my team specifically has been driving, which is an investigation and enforcement program focused on coordinated efforts to brigade and harass voices. We've done a number of enforcements under this, and if you look at those adversarial threat reports, you will see reporting on them and some analysis, and you'll see more coming out. I think there's a lot more work to be done there, but I do think there are some steps to take to counter it, and I wanted to make sure I got those out.
Okay, let me get a question in.
Of course.
There was a lot of people who wanted to know about the behavior of people who just join closed groups, because these are groups that we cannot monitor. We don't know what they discuss, and it's not as if it's not about privacy violation. It's just about some people coming together and having conversations that can be extremely harmful, targeting individuals, targeting good people. Is there any solution? Do you monitor this? Is there anything that Meta has by way of a solution? Because closed group seems to be creating a lot of tension, and a lot of journalists have been saying that closed groups have to be dealt with.
And so, yes, we do have some steps there, and I'll talk about them a little bit. I think one of the key things is what we're talking about here is, we'll see. One of the key things we're talking about here is a behavior. It's a coordinated effort. And in some ways, it doesn't matter if the person they're targeting is a good person or a bad person. Mm-hmm. You shouldn't be able to target and silence people. Yeah. When you target and silence someone, it's not just that they get silenced, it's everyone who identifies with them or looks like them also gets silenced, and you have these secondary effects. So closed groups, one of the things we've learned is that people coordinate to drive harassment and brigading in public. They coordinate on other platforms. They coordinate in close groups. They will use any medium that's available. One of the lessons, any medium that's available, a bad actor will use. This is a reason why the enforcement that I described, those threat reports, we've done more than 150 of these public reports at this point. A number of those involve actors that are coordinating in closed groups. So our investigations and enforcement does cover closed groups. And we will follow the threat actors wherever they go. And one of the key things is, because we investigate based on the behavior, the coordinated networks, you've heard Maria talk about coordinated networks. It's actually, there's some interesting similarities in the investigative methodology. We can find them in closed groups. We can find them when they're distributed in different ways. And we've had a lot of success in finding and countering those types of groups, actors.
So a lot of women journalists who are here, they've been complaining about the way in which they get trolled and their online experience being extremely, very different to that of men. And by way of protection, there are things that are there specific things that they should be doing, and is there anyone they can reach out to for advice, support? This is increasing particularly in South Asia and rest of the world as well, where women get attacked a lot. And there's been a lot of research done recently, and Maria yesterday spoke about it. And our experience online is generally a terrible one. So what has Meta done with regard to this?
Yeah, so Daniel Citron, who's a brilliant writer in this space, has written about how the nature of the internet can recreate the environment that enabled the anti-immigrant mobs of the 19th century by essentially allowing people to organize quickly, allowing people to dehumanize their targets, and allowing people to feel like they can get away with it. And one of the worst parts about this is that women are the most frequent target. I have had the unfortunate experience of supporting people very close to me going through exactly this. So I've seen what this targeting looks like. And I see it in particular, as you might imagine, I get criticized a decent amount online, but it's nothing like what I see women face. And you can see the differences, and I can see it very viscerally. There are a number of things to be done about this, and I think there is more to be done too, but a couple of key things. First, if we think about the model I mentioned before, there is a women's safety hub that has a whole series of tools available that women can take themselves. So for example, you can silence certain hashtags. You can respond to certain actions that you see. That is one thing that we have published that I think is useful for people to see. Second, that program that I mentioned, Facebook Protect, provides some specific protections that are especially useful for female voices and for women who are targeted. And so I would encourage women to join that. But the third thing is, this trend that you're describing is a big part of why my team has built and is focused on what we call emerging harms, and has built a series of enforcement regimes around this type of brigading and harassment. Because there are a number of things that women can do to protect themselves, but the last thing you want to do in a space like this is rely on the victims to defend themselves completely, because all you're doing is shifting the burden to the targets. One of the most effective tools is to find and identify repeat offenders, the most aggressive actors that repeatedly coordinate to drive this harm. And don't just take them down, but take them down publicly. Make sure people see what happens and share information about that type of activity so that other defender teams can take similar actions. So we're hunting for and finding and removing networks that engage in this type of thing, let's just say far too frequently, and that coordinate to do this. And what you will see in the months ahead is more and more examples as we bring this out, take this down, and share this information. And I have found that that is a useful way to take the wind out of the sails of some of these most determined threat actors. It's far from a perfect solution. This is an incredibly hard problem, but I do think it's a useful step in the right direction.
So I come from Sri Lanka, and Sri Lanka has a bad history with Facebook. And there are so many other countries that have got, had similar examples, and I can imagine so many, from Nepal to India to Myanmar. But I think it's time to open the floor now and take some questions so that it's not just one of us talking. And there have been so many people who wanted to ask you questions. And to an extent, it looks at journalist safety for sure, safety online. But do we have people ready to ask questions? Yes, please.
Yes.
Yeah, just
No, mine have all been.
no
short.
statements, but quick questions. And meanwhile, Dennis, please, if you have questions that are coming up online, so please share the questions as well. We just got 20 minutes only, so please be brief. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Is this on? Okay. So we appreciate the work you're trying to do to eliminate bad actors. But I think you're ignoring the elephant in the room, and that is that Facebook itself. And that is Facebook itself is a bad actor. And we know from Frances Haugen, the whistleblowers documents and stuff that she's disclosed, that Facebook repeatedly ignored its own team's findings, that the algorithm was exaggerating all the bad behavior and sending people down rabbit holes and so forth and so on. And the problem is, that is how Facebook makes its money, by increasing engagement. So there's this basic contradiction that Facebook makes money by being a bad actor. And what can you do about that?
Thank you.
So I think it will surprise no one that this is something I hear quite a bit. We were just talking about this. And the fundamental truth, though, is that's just not how the algorithm works. And there's a bunch of really obvious reasons for that. I could say that the reasons are because of sort of how problematic it is, but truthfully, it's because if you want to build a functioning environment and business that people want to be part of, you can't fill it with outrage. People don't want that. And in fact, users have said that over and over again and have said that to us. Advertisers don't want their products advertised next to disinformation, next to divisive narratives. And users, if you want to build a platform that people will go to, spend 10 minutes on, and then leave and never come back to, you can fill it with that type of stuff. But if you want to build a space that people want to engage with, want to spend time on, it can't work like that. Now, the problem and the challenge, of course, is that when people gather together, there will be threat actors that try to exploit the platform. And in a platform of 2.5 billion people, a small number of people can cause a lot of harm. And that is absolutely true and a serious problem. What I can say to that is I and my team and the other teams at Trust and Safety and the other teams we work with, I am at Facebook and I'm at Meta because it's the place where I can do the most good in trying to tackle these threats. I've worked in security from government, from the prosecutorial space, building systems, in advocacy. And I have never been at a place where you can actually make direct progress against these threats for one simple reason. We always think online about how the attackers, the bad guys, have an advantage because they get to move first, they get to move quickly. But the truth is, all the harm that we're talking about happens on websites, it happens on social media platforms, which means that over time, we can learn from what the threat actors are doing, and we can build our systems to be more resilient to them and more resistant to them. And I have a bunch of examples where we have found that, we have seen these types of techniques and been able to change the platform to make them less effective, to slow down the bad actors and to make it harder for them. Doesn't mean they give up. It doesn't mean they put down their things and go home. But what it means is that over time, they become less and less effective. And platforms working together with governments, working together with civil society and the media can be a very effective team at countering these threats. That's what I've seen, and that's the sort of focus of our work.
Meghna?
Hi, I'm Meghnad Bose from Delhi. First of all, I'd just like to say that I agree with everything you've said in theory, but I've got a couple of questions about what Meta is doing in practice. And first up is that in India, we know that there is a coordinated network of actors online on Facebook and its other platforms, which are spreading communal disinformation and communal hate and calls for violence, communal violence in India. We know that you know that too, because former Facebook India policy head, while she was Facebook India policy head, told employees at Facebook, punishing violations by politicians from Mr. Modi's party would damage the company's business prospects in the country, unquote. Since then, Ms. Das has resigned, but we still don't know what Meta is doing any differently from what they did when Ms. Das was in her position of power. So if you could elaborate on how you're countering these networks in India. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So this is one of the reasons why we have those adversarial threat reports, is that when we investigate and take down one of these networks, we share information about it publicly. Because I think people don't necessarily trust that we're doing everything we should. And I think it's really important that people be able to see that. So what I can tell you in the security world is that the enforcement work that my team has done, a number of our enforcements have been against networks operating in India. A number of them have been against networks that target some in India and some in other neighboring countries. And we published information about that. And you'll see us continue to do that. So I would look at the next threat report and the coming threat reports, and you will see more information about what we're doing. One caveat I will offer, though, is that in my experience, far more things online look like coordinated networks than actually are coordinated networks. There's a very common pattern where I think we jump quickly to thinking that things are sophisticated, coordinated networks run by governments causing harm. My team, we have relationships with and we get information from investigators around the world. And very frequently, we will get information about a particular coordinated network that is clearly driving harm. We will investigate it and we will see clearly these are real people. They are not coordinated. We will enforce against some of the pieces of content that might violate, but it's not actually a coordinated network. That's not to say they aren't operating. There are very serious influence operations and coordinated threat actors out there. The volume, I think, is smaller than people think, but the harm they cause is quite large. That doesn't mean we should ignore the problem, but it does mean that jumping to the conclusion that these operations are coordinated, often they're not. And so I think there is more work to do there. There's a reason we publish these reports, because many people share the concerns that you just described. But also I find often people jump to this conclusion. And it's interesting, I will say, one thing and one incredible power that journalists have is the ability to personalize and bring forward the human component to these stories. And it's an extremely powerful thing that journalists can do. And we've had a number of cases working with, for example, we did an investigation into an operation that was run by Russian actors based in Accra, Ghana, where they were pretending to be an NGO. And we worked together with Clarissa Ward from CNN. And she actually went to Accra and put a microphone in the face of these actors And you had the enforcement, and then you had the personal face of it, and it was incredibly powerful. But the other side of this is that reporting on these things carries a particular and challenging responsibility. We know that the threat actors behind this, a key part of their goal is to make themselves appear more powerful than they are. That was a central tenet of Russian operations leading up to the current day. And so as we report about this ourselves, we are always thinking, how do we do this in a way that doesn't hyperbolize the problem and that doesn't essentially do the bad guys' work for them? And that's a very difficult challenge in reporting on this stuff.
Please go ahead. Please go ahead.
Okay. So my name is Hafina. I come from Kashmir, and India is one of your biggest markets. And when we talk about India, like there are lots of pages on Facebook. I can name two, but which is Jaya Rashtra, Hindu Rashtra, with 12 lakh followers. There is another one which is RSS Workers, which is more than 3 lakh followers. So there are dozens of them because I have done a research on it. I just want to, this is not a question, but I have seen your videos online where you say that you use AI algorithms to, to actually counter the misinformation and put down these pages and hashtags. But you also said that you use personal interventions when the pages are large and you need to like look into it personally, and then you use that personal intervention to do that. I just like, there are dozens of such pages, and there are like open thread calls, rape thread calls, especially after the abrogation of 370, when it happened, there were open statements from these groups that, hey, we can now go and marry Kashmiri women because now we don't have that sort of constitutional guarantee to follow. I just want to know, when are you going to put down those pages?
So I don't know those two particular pages, so I don't know the specifics of that. What I can tell you is we certainly miss things, and we will continue to miss things. I think that on a platform this large, in any community space, it's not going to be perfect. What I do know is you mentioned AI and you mentioned expert investigators. What I have found is the most effective way to counter the threats is to combine those two things. So we have automated systems that work at very large scale that my team isn't involved in, that a lot of the specific content questions you're raising are rooted in, right? And these automated systems will automatically remove pieces of content that violate. But the truth is, you can defeat automated systems. If you're determined, you can pick language that's going to get around an automated system. And we know that. If you tune an automated system to make sure that there are no false negatives, meaning to make sure you don't miss anything, then what happens is you end up taking down a whole bunch of innocent people and non-violating content. That's why we have to have this combination with expert teams that hunt for the most sophisticated threat actors. Sometimes what that means is a bad guy avoids the automated systems and there's a lag before the human experts can catch them. That, I think, is a reality of the adversarial space. If you can come by afterwards, happy to take down those particular pages, and I'll make sure that the teams that work in that space are looking at them.
There are dozens of them, and I'll send you all of them.
Sure, I appreciate that.
Yes, my name is Shahid. I'm from Dhaka, Bangladesh. You know, Bangladesh is one of the biggest market for Facebook, as it has 50 million users in a tiny land. So our government always blame that as the largest social platform, you don't have any local mechanism to filter sensitive content. That means our government has to email to you first, to your head office, then you will act according to the you response on the basis of email. You don't have any local office, local manpower. So it takes time to protect privacy and others. So what is your reaction?
So we have experts in the relevant languages from around the world who work on these issues. I can say that in Bangladesh in particular, in my team, if you look back at some of those threat reports I mentioned, a number of them emerge from Bangladesh or target Bangladeshi voices. Many of them were things that we found proactively. So we hunt for those directly. We find them, we remove them often before anyone raises them to us. Part of this is there are many languages in the world, and always language skills will be a challenge. We have expertise in many, many languages. This is partly why we also focus on behavioral enforcement. If a network is harassing someone, is working together to brigade them, it doesn't matter what language they're in. It doesn't matter what the content is. We can investigate the behavior and enforce against it. I think there's a lot of questions and pressure to have local offices in countries around the world. I think there are two important things that everyone should think about. The first is when you fragment teams into smaller and smaller groups, they become less efficient and less effective to deal with threats when they emerge. Having a regional focus often means if one threat evolves, the team can quickly get other people in the same office to respond. I've often found that that's more effective. Not always the case. The second thing, of course, is it's extremely critical to have people with local cultural understanding and local language understanding. The more you put people in particular countries also, the more risk you take in a world of increasingly illiberal and autocratic governments, that the governments will threaten or put pressure on people within those countries. And it's very interesting, I think over the past several years, there's been a steady and right pressure from the human rights community to have more people in countries around the world. One of the consequences of that is that we see more and more governments around the world being very willing to threaten employees in country as a way to pressure companies into doing what they want. And at the end of the day, if a government is going to threaten a company inside that government's borders, companies are going to have a very difficult time standing up to that. And I think that's by design. I don't think we want companies to be able to stand up to governments in that way. But it is a consequence of putting more people out forward, out in front. So there's a balance to strike. I guess that's what I would say.
Uni Lubis from Indonesia. You know, Indonesia is, I don't know, probably the 4th or 5th largest Facebook market. So we are heavy regulated, even though Indonesian press still quite relatively democratic, but we have several law that can bring the journalists to prison, to jail, because of misinformation, because of defamation, and all of this thing. And there is a growing demand recently from the mainstream media. Let's say probably hundreds of media, mainstream media, in their chief editor, we have a meeting a lot with the government official, with political, to also punish the platform if they are distributing hoax, misinformation, any content that media, if we are producing that kind of article or content, we get punished. It's an unfair treatment between the media with the distribution platform. What is your take on that? Thank you.
Thank you.
I think, so around the world, I think there is a very deep conversation about security online. Security means different things to different people. And one of the things that we have seen, we were talking about illiberal governments and autocracies being very willing to use the phrase security as an excuse to assert more control over public debate and put more pressure on platforms that are often voices that enable critics and enable regime critics. A really good example of this that's quite stark and very sharp in my mind because of the work we've been doing, if you look at the invasion of Ukraine, one of the key tools that Ukrainian voices used to speak to Russian citizens was Instagram. And it's maybe not a huge surprise that Instagram is now blocked in Russia. You see a steady effort to try to use techniques like this to silence critics and to silence these open conversations that regimes don't want to have. Now, there's a really difficult balance to strike between holding platforms to account and making sure we do what we should be doing, and giving these autocratic regimes the tools to essentially turn down and lock down public debate further. This is one of the reasons why we put out a set of recommendations for steps to take from a legislative perspective to counter these threats, including steps that would hold us further to account. I think one of the most important things, and there's a reason that we and I all the time call for regulatory action and legislative action from democracies. And the reason is we need democracies to lead in this space because the autocracies in the world are not waiting. And they would be very happy to be the ones to define the nature of public debate on the internet. And we need democratic steps to create frameworks and create rules here. I think that the DSA in Europe is a really valuable step, and I'm glad to see it. We've done a lot of work with the disinfo code there. I think there are more opportunities, but I definitely see that trend, and we see it targeted at journalists. We see it targeted at platforms using similar techniques.
Hi, how large is your team and in how many regions do they operate? I understand your point earlier about not wanting to be in every country.
Yeah, so I lead an intentionally small team that is spread across the company and coordinates a much larger team. So the team that counters sort of determined threats is hundreds of people. My team that helps think about sort of specific strategy is much smaller. But that's intentional, right? Like a dozen, 2 dozen people. And the idea is on each of these threats, you have investigators, you have that will hunt for the threats. You have teams like mine that think through how to deal with the problem. You have product engineers that build solutions. We have lawyers, right? So you have a very large team, but it's broken up into a bunch of places, if that makes sense.
Yes, it does. Also, where do you publish these reports that you mentioned? And why did you go from publishing them monthly down to quarterly? I would have thought the other way around would be more logical.
Yeah, we publish them on our website. We also, every time we post them, I will tweet about them and put them out on other types of social media, on Facebook and elsewhere, so people can see them. We also work with press so that they can do their own reporting on it. Also, when we share information with research organizations, they often write their own reports that we will then link to. Now, the question on timing, the reason we did that is it takes a lot of work to build a report with enough depth every month. It was taking away from the team's ability to investigate these things, and we wanted to prioritize that. But also, doing it quarterly means we can better talk about the trends that we're seeing and the patterns, and that's been really valuable. So for example, one of the big trends we've seen that I think surprises people, in 2017, 2018, 2019, even 2020, the amount of CIB, influence operations, that was foreign was about equal to the amount that was domestic. Even that surprises people. I think, to be honest, everyone thought it was all foreign interference. But in 2021 and coming into this year, a substantial majority is domestic. What I mean by that is we are seeing far more cases where people are trying to manipulate public debate in their own country than across borders. And this might be governments targeting their own people. Increasingly, it's PR firms working on behalf of politicians. That type of trend analysis we can do better if there's sort of larger blocks so that we can show the change.
And finally,
I think, yeah, please.
Thank you for the
Yeah.
questions.
Take a very small,
Do we also have questions sent
very
via
small question.
email?
I'll take a very small question. I'll keep it very short.
Please.
You said that Facebook is committed to keeping journalists safe. So I want to ask you that if a journalist or citizen journalists, journalists who are not really journalists, but they are doing reporting, will Facebook hand over will they hand over the data of these journalists or dissenting voices to the government should they ask for it, even if those posts or their questions or whatever their content is within the Facebook's community standards? Will it still give it to because the government is the bad actor in a country like India, where I come from? And second question, is the security measures that you have in a country like India the same as in US? Like in US, we can expect President Donald Trump to be banned from social platforms, but we see that in India, we are literally giving away data of journalists from Kashmir to Kanyakumari in the hands of the government to be put away in prisons when the, yes, thank you.
Understood. Our security steps are different around the world depending on the threats that exist in particular regions. I think the question about government compulsion of data is a really hard one. The simplest answer is whenever we get an effort to disclose data, we read the local law as narrowly as possible. We have legal teams that push back on unlawful or illegitimate pressures for data, and we regularly are in exactly the situation you're describing, where we're trying to defend people against those pressures. I think one of the core challenges is to remember when a government is a bad actor, wherever you are, it can be very hard to stand up against that. We do that as much as we can, but I also think this is another reason why the voices of democracies are so important here. When we see autocratic governments, wherever they are, putting pressure on public debate, putting pressure on journalists, putting pressure on platforms, I think it's really important that democracies in the West and around the world stand up and signal back how problematic that is, so that the people on the front lines can do everything they can to counter it.
We just have
Thank you for the questions.
yeah, very few minutes, but do we have
Okay.
questions from virtual participants as well? We also have virtual participants, right? There could be questions from them as well.
Yes, so we have one question we can ask from the
Hold on a
virtual
second, we'll just
participants.
take that question, yeah?
Okay, so we have a question from EA Hawaii 1902. I assume you find bad actors with algorithms. When do real humans get involved with finding and confirming bad actors and determining Meta's takedown policies?
So the core of the work of my team is actually investigator driven. It's not algorithm driven. We use both. So the short answer is when you have less sophisticated actors, algorithms can be very effective. And for some of these, the volume is so high that you could never have a human investigate every lead. When you have more sophisticated threat actors, the most determined, algorithms, automated systems, machine learning will not find them. So you have to have both. And so the way I think about it is we are asking investigators online to essentially find a needle in a stack of needles. You use automation to filter down the stack and make it a little bit smaller so that the human investigators can focus on the most serious threats.
Okay, Amy Shen from Taiwan. There are many advertisement of scam on Facebook, and many consumers were cheated and lost money. And what's your solution? Thank you.
Thank you.
So when we talk about frauds and scams, we have an entire stream of work focused on sort of financially motivated bad actors. It's very different than influence operations. Influence operations, there are relatively few of them, but each one is very sophisticated and can cause a lot of harm. Frauds and scams, there's a lot of them. And individually, each one causes a lot of harm to an individual, but the aggregate harm is more spread out. So we have a different system. We have more automation that catches these. But one piece to your question that you will see, beginning last report, we've started reporting more about human-driven, expert-driven investigations into the most determined fraudsters we see. So you're going to see us using more of this expert investigation to take out the repeat offenders, the most egregious offenders. One of the unfortunate realities in security is that the bad guys will always keep trying. One of the most effective things you can do to counter them is to impose cost on them to make their incentives less to keep doing this. So, for example, one of the trends that we've seen is a rise in what I would call violations for hire. So these are bad actors who have learned how to hack into accounts, or who have learned how to run disinformation or run fraud. And rather than doing it for themselves, they sell it to the highest bidder. We've had a number of reports where we identify a bunch of these people, take them down, describe it publicly. We have improved our systems to make it harder to do this and set a bunch of controls in place. Another thing that would be really valuable here would be legislation. Government steps to make that type of business model built on harm and violation illegal. What you would do is a lot of these firms have a legitimate business and then an illegitimate business on the side. And if you can hold into risk their legitimate business, you can incentivize them to stop the illegitimate business. You'll often hear me talk about how the only way to counter these threats is a whole of society response, government, industry, civil society, and media. That's one of the reasons why I say it. I don't think tech can solve that problem by itself. I think there's more we can do and there's more we need to do, and we'll keep doing it. But I think you need to have the other communities too.
We can have her question. Yeah, the last one.
Yeah, hi, fantastic panel so far. I'm Allison from California. Last week, Bloomberg reported that Facebook is removing a lot of its support from CrowdTangle, which I'm told is a very popular tool for journalists because it increases transparency and helps a lot of people including my colleagues at the UN Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, track sentiment throughout the world. Is Facebook defunding CrowdTangle? And if so, do you have any notes to speak on that? Thanks.
And so perhaps the best answer to that is in December, we launched a new program on CrowdTangle to share more information with researchers. I mentioned it early about our influence operations. We're expanding that program. We're adding more people to it. So we're not defunding or deprecating CrowdTangle. There is more work being done to build this type of work and to make sure that we can share information with researchers so they can identify threats across the platform and do their own work. I haven't seen the specific article, so I won't comment on what they said exactly, but what I can tell you is, what I know is we are expanding the work that my team is doing in particular on this platform, and we'll be doing more work working with researchers going forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much for all the questions. We just wanted to actually ask a question around elections and on strategic foresight, because a lot of countries, several countries are going to go through elections in the coming years. And what does it mean? Because during elections, particularly before elections, there's so much of disinformation, hate campaigns that take place on social media platforms. And if you think about Pakistan, if you think about several other countries, it's going to happen. So it's going to explode. So what can Meta do to at least contain it a bit? Is it possible at all?
It's a very good question. And I will go back to my whole of society point. I don't think that tech can solve this problem on our own, but I do think there are things we can do. So my team has a specific pillar. A quarter of my team is called threat ideation. It's a strategic foresight function. It's based around the idea of ahead of major elections, ahead of major events or new product launches. We should be looking around the corner, thinking about the types of threats that will emerge and thinking about how we prepare for them. I can't talk about the elections that are coming up because obviously I can't talk about the threats we're seeing before they happen because that might tip off the bad guys. What I can say is before major elections, months in advance, we bring together a team internally and we run a threat ideation. This will include people from my teams. It will include local experts. It will include product experts. It'll include a whole range of people who understand different types of threats. And we use a combination of red teaming, tabletop exercises, and similar techniques to ask, what are the threats going to look like? And what do we need to do to prepare? And often what comes out of that is a couple of things. First, we might find ways to improve the product, to make changes to the platform, to make a particular threat we're expecting less effective. And we'll do these early enough that we can start to build that if appropriate. Second, we might identify particular types of threat actors that we think are going to be very active. Will it be a foreign targeted election or will it be more domestic? And we can shift our investigative focus to make sure we're ready for that, right? And then third, we might identify specific teams within region that are not ours but are external that we should be supporting or we should be partnering with to get information to. And we'll build all three of those up. Right. So as a simple example of this, ahead of the 2020 elections in the United States, that's now a while back, so I can say it, we identified 9 major threat trends we anticipated would develop around the election. We used them to focus our product investment and our investigative work, and 8 of those 9 materialized, and we had sort of built systems that were ready for that because of that work. We try to do that with other major elections around the world, whether you're talking about Brazil, the US midterms, India, many others that are coming up.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for being here and for the questions. And thanks, Nathaniel, for being here.
Thank you all very much. And thank you again for all the work you do.